Hello and welcome to this special broadcast here on CNN News 18. We are counting down to the British elections, the elections within the Conservative Party to choose their next leader and the next Prime Minister of Britain. So 5 rounds of polling has happened within the members of Parliament, and the last two candidates standing are Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Liz Truss, the former Foreign Secretary. These two candidates will now vie for a runoff in about 6 weeks' time amongst the members of the Conservative Party, who will then decide which of these two leaders are eligible to be the next Prime Minister of Britain. So, what are the chances for Rishi Sunak in particular? Because there's a lot of interest in his candidature, not just here in South Asia, but right around the world. There would be the question of history. Is Britain ready for its first ever non-white Prime Minister? In the case of Liz Truss, too, there would be history that would be made if she were to be the choice of the majority of the Conservative Party. She would be only the third woman Prime Minister that Britain would have produced. So joining me now to discuss this about what the pollsters feel of the chances of these two candidates, Mr. Martin Baxter is the CEO of Electoral Calculus. He's one of the most renowned pollsters in the United Kingdom. Welcome to the program, Mr. Baxter.
Hello, nice to be here.
Also joining us, Professor Tim Bale is a professor of politics at the University of London. He's published multiple books on the Conservative Party and broad trends in the Conservative Party. Welcome to the broadcast, Professor Bale.
Nice to be here.
All right. So let me start with you, Martin Baxter. We've had 5 rounds of polls. It boils down to these two candidates, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. What, in your definition, is at stake in this election for the Conservative Party and indeed for Britain?
Well, I think there's probably going to be a balance of two things. One is a ideological idea about what the policies of the party and the government should be, and we can talk more about the details of that. But there's obviously a little bit at the moment that Rishi Sunak is slightly more centre or to the left of the Conservative Party, the centre of the Conservative Party, and Liz Truss is a bit more on the right. So that will be one that plays out. And I think another thing that will be very important is electability. The Conservative Party are not in a good place in the overall national opinion polls at the moment, and they want to look for an election winner. That's very much what they did 2 years ago when they picked Boris Johnson, where polling that we did and others as well showed that Boris Johnson was very much an election winner. He'd won the Mayor of London, he'd won the EU referendum result. He just kind of wins and wins on electoral events. And I think the problem for the Conservatives this time is that it's not so obvious which one is an election winner, if either. But I think those will be the themes: ideology and popularity.
Professor Bale, there is, of course, a great deal of interest in Sunak's candidature here in India and the rest of the South Asian region, in fact, amongst the Indian diaspora around the world. But aside of that, if he were to win the Conservative Party leadership fight, he would become the first ever non-white Prime Minister of Britain. Is Britain ready for that?
Yes, I mean, I think we are. The minority population of Britain is getting on for 15% now. So I don't think there is any great barrier. And indeed, the Conservatives might do themselves a favour by choosing someone who, in some senses, looks a little bit more like 21st century Britain. So I don't think there is any particular barrier there. It could be, of course, that some members of the Conservative Party who have quite socially conservative attitudes may balk a little at choosing someone from an ethnic minority, but I don't think that will be as big a problem as some people suspect.
All right, we'll try and see. I think there is a bit of a broadcast disconnect in terms of the broadband speed. We'll try and see if we can connect back with Professor Bale. But let me come back to Mr. Baxter. As you said, the fundamental contest is where these two stand ideologically, on which end of conservatism. Rishi Sunak, by virtue of being the former finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he, of course, guided Britain through much of the pandemic. But there's also criticism that one of his plans is to tax the wealthy, whereas Liz Truss says that that is not conservatism. And if she were to be elected as Prime Minister, one of the first things she would do is to cut taxes. At a time when most ordinary Britons are worried about cost of living, where do these candidates stand in terms of taxes?
Well, it's a very good question. Of course, it's not completely clear that Rishi Sunak in the past has talked quite a good talk about sort of free market, small state conservatism. But in office, while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, taxes have risen and risen. They're now at relatively high levels on a historic basis. So Liz Truss says she wants a smaller state and lower taxes. And I suppose one thing will be whether the public believe that or not, and the members believe that. In terms of what the public do think on this, that Rishi Sunak is, amongst Conservative voters, more popular than Liz Truss. So not making the distinction, this is voters, not members. But obviously the voters are going to be very important later when there's an ultimate general election. So Rishi Sunak's got an advantage on the voters, partly because, as you mentioned, that during the COVID period, he was, spending money quite freely with the furlough scheme and other measures to keep people in incomes even when their jobs were in abeyance. So with the voters, Sunak's got an edge. With the members, it's harder to poll. There's been some polling on the members, and that seems to put Liz Truss ahead, but nobody knows quite for sure on that. And the other one we have in Britain is we've got active betting markets. People can gamble. They can kind of like buy shares in the two candidates. And at the moment, that's fairly even. It's around about 60-40 for Liz Truss against Rishi Sunak, though Rishi Sunak slightly above 40% when I just last looked earlier today. So that still means I think that there's very much everything to play for, and there's not a clear leader at the moment. The MPs were clearly preferring Sunak a little bit, but it was not a very decisive election at the MP level compared, say, to Boris Johnson, who's quite further ahead, I think 2 years ago. So it's pretty open. It could certainly be Rishi Sunak as easily as it could be Liz Truss. But it will come down, I think, that the ideology will be a component of it, and how much people's fiscal policy is credible, and whether on the monetary policy becomes an issue. That some people are beginning to say that in this country, inequality and the wealth are helped by these really low interest rates. That benefits people with lots of financial assets, which is certainly Rishi Sunak and his family would qualify for that. So has he been serving his financial interests over the country's interests with his monetary policy? Is an attack line we might see. I don't know. But overall, the Conservatives have to face the fact that they are currently not popular with the public. Boris Johnson was a big election winner. They have ditched him. They are now left with people who don't have a proven track record in winning elections. And our latest polling suggests that either candidate would lose quite heavily to Labour under Keir Starmer. So they may be, this might be an election for the president to be captain of the Titanic after the ships hit the iceberg.
Well, it is an unenviable job in any case. But I want to ask Professor Bale, one of the things that Mr. Baxter said, it's not the country that's choosing the next prime minister, it is the Conservative Party. And in the 170, 180,000 odd members that the party has who choose the next prime minister, that demographic is more wealthy, more white than the country is right now. So in that demographic, are they ready for a non-white candidate to be the next prime minister of Britain?
Well, we have done research on the Conservative Party memberships since 2013, actually. And one of the questions that we have asked them over the course of that research is the extent to which they'd be prepared to see more or fewer people from certain groups coming into Parliament. And for the most part, Conservative members, would be reasonably happy to see more minority ethnic candidates come into Parliament. So I don't think it's as big a barrier as people think. Having said that, I would have to say that I don't think a South Asian background is a problem. I think for some Conservative Party members, a Muslim background would be a problem, but of course Rishi Sunak doesn't come from that particular community. So as far as the barriers to Rishi Sunak are concerned, I think they are actually a lot lower than people think in the Conservative Party.
One of the barriers potentially could be this perception that his wife has domicile status that is not in the UK. There is perhaps this feeling amongst ordinary Britons that here's a rich boy who's entitled and using loopholes, tax loopholes, to try and save millions of pounds in taxes every year. using his wife's domicile status. Do you reckon that is a big concern for British voters because of Bale?
Well, I think certainly it won't be as big a concern for Conservative Party members as it will be for voters. But for voters, as Martin will confirm, it is a very serious issue. If you look at Rishi Sunak's favourability rating when he was Chancellor, it absolutely tanked after the non-dom issue came up. There was an awful lot of unhappiness at the thought of someone who was already super rich, if you like, and therefore subject to allegations that he was out of touch with ordinary people, being married to someone who, it was alleged anyway, had claimed non-dom status in order to avoid millions of pounds worth of tax. That really went down very, very badly. And that combined, I think, with a spring statement, a kind of mini budget, that didn't really do much to help people with this cost of living crisis that we're suffering, really did Rishi Sunak an awful lot of harm. So you see a candidate here who was the most popular politician in Britain during the pandemic when he was giving out lots of public money to people to get them through COVID-19. Actually go to one of the most unpopular politicians in Britain in the space of practically a month or so. So yes, that still will be a problem, I think, and that will be a huge attack line for the Labour Party. Whether Liz Truss will use it, however, is another matter.
I want to talk a little bit about that with Martin Baxter, because I think in the debate, Rishi Sunak did refer to his wife's non-dom status. Indirectly, he talked about his parents-in-law, and he pitched it as a great conservative story, a man with limited resources, with a great idea, entrepreneurial instincts, went on to found one of the biggest IT companies, not just here in India, but around the world. And he pitched it as a big conservative idea. Would that find resonance amongst Conservative Party members?
Well, I think it is, as Tim says, very much a two-edged sword in the members. That I think just also going back to the ethnicity question, I agree with Tim. I don't think that's a big issue. He's slightly more vulnerable, oddly, on the question of his own green card from the United States that he only gave up recently. But although the US is a very strong ally of the UK, it is slightly odd to be kind of on track to be a citizen of the US whilst you're sort of moving up the UK political ladder. So that bit, I think, is one that will come back as well. The richness of his wife, I think, is definitely an issue. I mean, I was just sort of doing the numbers. I think she's worth something like 7,000 crore rupees, which is quite a lot of money in anybody's book. And even in Britain, it's about 100 times more than the rich people are worth. So he is very much in the super rich league. And you can see that Labour are maybe going to have some fun with that if he's made leader. On the other hand, just to balance slightly what Tim was saying, it's certainly true that the shine came off Rishi Sunak with these revelations about the non-dom status and the green card. But he still has quite a bit of residual affection with the public. It's not as good as it was, but it's still better than many other Conservatives. But it is, slightly, there's some of the shine has come off. So it's not as strong as it was for him. And that makes it more difficult, when the other issues are already kind of swirling around. But I think it's all survivable, but it just, it makes it less of a coronation than it would be. If he hadn't had the negatives in the COVID crisis, I think he'd kind of be sailing through to be on track, unstoppable, not at the moment.
Professor Bale, let's talk about Liz Truss. You've already seen it just in the last 24 hours. So a lot of videos, old videos, memes coming out to the fore about some of the gaffes that she has made. A lot of people have picked on the fact that she's imitating, whether by design or not, we don't know, Margaret Thatcher. Would she be seen as the weaker candidate in terms of credentials, in terms of policy making, in terms of just experience to deal with the gamut of issues that Britain's facing right now?
I don't think she would suffer any problems with experience. I mean, she's been a cabinet minister now for 8 years, longer than Rishi Sunak has been. And she obviously occupies now one of the great offices of state, the Foreign Office. And she's done jobs in other places. Her economic credentials aren't perhaps as strong as his, but her overall experience is pretty good. I think where she suffers is presentationally. She is just not one of those politicians who is naturally fluent, who naturally connects with the public. And she is even at times quite wooden. And as you say, some of her speeches have been rather cruelly caricatured on occasions, as has her fondness for, on some occasions, being something of a Margaret Thatcher tribute act. Wearing a furry hat when she visited Russia, for example, or riding around in a tank in Eastern Europe, all very reminiscent of Margaret Thatcher. And even some of the clothes that she's worn during the debates have been compared to Margaret Thatcher. So I think she really does have to, in some ways, get away from that. But on the other hand, of course, Margaret Thatcher is an icon for the Conservative Party members and indeed for British voters in general. She's a bit love-hate, but she's still very, very well respected. So appealing to Margaret Thatcher is actually something you're going to see Rishi Sunak as well as Liz Truss do. So simply being associated with Maggie isn't necessarily a bad thing in the Conservative Party.
All right, I'll give the final word to Mr. Baxter. Who would you put your money on? Sunak, of course, finishing first among the two in the 5 rounds of polling that we've had. But when it comes to a head-on, face-to-face runoff, if you will, it could be a different picture.
Yes, it's a tough question because it is finely balanced at the moment. I think as polling evidence comes in, I think we're going to see what Tim says has come to be important, that in terms of presentation, Sunak has the edge, and that might in the end move kind of the Tory party's head over their heart. In their heart, they would kind of like Liz Truss's ideas, but in their head, they maybe know that that's less electable. But it's so I think they might go with their heads, but you don't know. We don't know for sure.
All right, we'll see. Either way, some would say history would have been created if it's Sunak. Of course, it would be the first non-white Prime Minister of Britain. And if it is Liz Truss, it would be only the 3rd woman Prime Minister that Britain has seen. Thank you very much, Martin Baxter, Professor Tim Bale, for joining us on the special broadcast.
Thank you.